The ancient library beneath Al-Azhar University in Cairo holds secrets that have been buried for over 1,000 years. Dr. Yahya Al-Mansouri, one of the world's most respected Quranic scholars, sits alone among dusty manuscripts, his hands trembling as he stares at a discovery that could change everything. The parchment before him contains verses that don't match any known text, verses that suggest fundamental alterations to the holy book itself. But Yahya isn't just any scholar. For 20 years, he's been secretly investigating inconsistencies in ancient manuscripts, following a trail that powerful figures desperately want to keep hidden. Now, with assassins closing in and only 24 hours before a global Islamic conference where he plans to reveal his findings, Yahya faces an impossible choice. The evidence in his possession could either purify the faith or destroy it completely. As dawn breaks over the minarets of Cairo, Yahya realizes that some truths are worth dying for. But are they worth killing the faith of 2 billion believers? What would you do if you discovered that everything you believed might be built on a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yahya's fingers traced the faded ink, each word a potential earthquake that could topple centuries of belief. The manuscript's carbon dating confirmed his worst fears. This text predated the Uthmanic Codex by decades. The implications sent ice through his veins. His phone buzzed against the wooden table, the harsh vibration echoing through the vaulted chamber. 3 missed calls from his daughter Amira in London. She knew nothing of his research, believing her father spent his days translating classical poetry. How could he tell her that everything she'd learned at his knee might be a carefully constructed deception? A footstep echoed from the corridor above. Yahya's breath caught. The library had been sealed for the night, and only 3 people possessed access keys. Professor Khalil, who'd been dead for 6 months, himself, and someone whose identity he discovered too late. He carefully photographed the manuscript with trembling hands, the camera flash illuminating Arabic script that shouldn't exist. Each image uploaded automatically to servers in 7 countries, his insurance policy against those who would silence him permanently. 20 years of research, thousands of documents, all pointing to the same devastating conclusion. Someone had systematically altered the Qur'an during the 3rd century of Islam. The footsteps grew closer, measured and deliberate. Yahya slipped the ancient parchment into a leather portfolio along with 3 other damning documents. Tomorrow's conference would be attended by every major Islamic authority in the world. They deserved the truth, regardless of the consequences. But first, he had to survive the night. The bronze door at the chamber's entrance creaked open. Yahya extinguished his reading lamp and pressed himself against a bookshelf filled with medieval commentaries. Through gaps between ancient volumes, he glimpsed a figure in modern dress scanning the room with practiced efficiency. Not a casual intruder, someone who knew exactly where to look. The man spoke into a wireless device, his voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber. He was here recently. The manuscripts are disturbed. Expand the search to a 3-kilometer radius. Yahya recognized the voice. Dr. Hassan Qadri, Deputy Director of the International Islamic Studies Council. A man he'd trusted, confided in, shared preliminary findings with 6 months ago. The same man who'd insisted Yahya's research was too dangerous and should be abandoned. Hassan's footsteps approached Yahya's hiding place. Through ancient leather bindings, Yahya watched his former colleague examine the reading table, noting the indentations left by the manuscript, the residual warmth of the extinguished lamp. "Dr. Al-Mansouri," Hassan called softly. "I know you're here. We need to discuss your presentation tomorrow." Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Yahya clutched the portfolio tighter, feeling the weight of evidence that could reshape the Islamic world or tear it apart. His life's work, his faith, his family's safety, all balanced on decisions made in the next 24 hours. Hassan pulled out his phone, speed-dialing a number. He's already gone, but he'll surface tomorrow at the conference. Make sure our people are in position. The bronze door slammed shut, footsteps receding into the labyrinthine corridors above. Yahya remained motionless for 10 minutes before emerging from his hiding place. His hands no longer trembled. 20 years of investigation had led to this moment of clarity. The truth demanded its revelation, regardless of cost. But Hassan's presence confirmed what Yahya had suspected for months. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of Islamic authority. Tomorrow's conference wouldn't be a scholarly presentation. It would be a battlefield where faith itself hung in the balance. Yahya gathered his remaining materials and headed for the hidden exit he'd discovered during his years of research. Dawn was breaking over Cairo, painting the ancient city in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in those narrow streets, men waited to kill him for knowledge he couldn't unknow. 24 hours remained until truth met consequence. The manuscript's ancient parchment felt like fragile skin beneath Yahya's trembling fingers as he spread it across his mahogany desk. The library's silence pressed against his ears, broken only by the distant hum of Cairo's restless streets filtering through the tall windows. He had spent 30 years studying Islamic texts, but nothing had prepared him for what lay before him now. The document bore the seal of the Abbasid Caliphate, its golden ink still gleaming after 9 centuries. Yahya's breath caught as he recognized the distinctive handwriting of Al-Tabari's personal scribe. This wasn't just any historical artifact, it was a direct account from one of Islam's most revered scholars, a man whose commentaries had shaped the faith for generations. But the words written in elegant Arabic script told a story that could demolish everything millions of believers held sacred. Yahya reached for his magnifying glass, his hands steadier now despite the magnitude of his discovery. Each line he translated sent ice through his veins. The manuscript detailed a series of meetings in Baghdad, circa 915 CE, where prominent scholars had allegedly altered key interpretations of the Qur'an to serve political purposes. Names that every Muslim knew by heart were mentioned alongside accusations that would be branded as heretical blasphemy. A sharp knock at the library door made him jump. Yahya quickly covered the manuscript with a copy of today's newspaper and called out in Arabic, "One moment, please." His research assistant, Amira, peered around the door. Her hijab framed a face marked by concern. "Professor, you've been in here since dawn. The afternoon prayer was called an hour ago." Yahya glanced at his watch, surprised to find it was past 3 o'clock. "Thank you, Amira. I'll join the congregation shortly." She hesitated at the threshold. "Is everything all right? You look pale, just tired. Too many late nights." He managed a reassuring smile. "Please go ahead without me." After Amira left, Yahya locked the door and returned to the manuscript. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Knowledge can be dangerous, Professor. Some doors should remain closed." The blood drained from his face. He set the phone aside with shaking hands and stared at the ancient document. Someone knew about his discovery, but that seemed impossible. He'd been alone when the manuscript was delivered yesterday evening, wrapped in oiled cloth inside a wooden box. The accompanying note had been brief, from a friend who values truth over comfort. Yahya photographed each page of the manuscript with his secure camera, uploading the images to an encrypted cloud storage account. If something happened to the original document, at least the evidence would survive. As he worked, his mind raced through the implications of what he had read. The manuscript claimed that during the reign of Caliph al-Muqtadir, a secret council had systematically modified scholarly interpretations to justify political decisions and consolidate power. Verses about warfare, governance, and religious authority had been recontextualized to serve the caliphate's expansionist agenda. The document even suggested that certain hadiths, sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, had been fabricated entirely. Another message appeared on his phone. "Your family in Alexandria is lovely. Your daughter Sarah walks to university every morning at 8:15. Yahya's chest tightened. The threat was unmistakable. He thought of Sarah's laugh, her fierce intelligence, her plans to become a doctor. The idea of her in danger because of his academic pursuits made him nauseated. He carefully rolled the manuscript and placed it in a climate-controlled storage tube. The smart thing would be to destroy it, pretend he had never seen it, return to his comfortable life of teaching and writing scholarly papers that challenged no one. But the historian in him rebelled against such intellectual cowardice. The call to evening prayer echoed across the city as Yahya made his decision. He would not be silenced by anonymous threats, but he would be careful. He sealed the manuscript in a safe, hidden behind a false panel in his office wall, then gathered his prayer mat and headed toward the mosque adjacent to the university. As he performed the ritual ablutions, Yahya caught sight of a man in a grey suit watching him from across the courtyard. When their eyes met, the stranger turned and melted into the crowd of worshippers. Paranoia or legitimate concern? Yahya could no longer tell the difference. During prayer, as he pressed his forehead to the ground in submission to Allah, Yahya found himself questioning everything he had believed about Islamic history. If the manuscript was authentic, and his initial analysis suggested it was, then centuries of religious scholarship had been built on corrupted foundations. The truth could liberate millions from false teachings, or it could shatter their faith entirely. When the prayers concluded, Yahya remained kneeling longer than usual, seeking guidance in the familiar Arabic supplications. The answer came not as divine revelation, but as grim certainty. He was running out of time to decide whether truth was worth the price of everything he loved. The call to Maghrib prayer echoed through the narrow streets of the old quarter as Yahya hurried through the labyrinthine alleys, his worn leather satchel clutched tightly against his chest. The ancient manuscript fragments inside seemed to burn through the bag, their implications weighing heavier with each step. He had spent the afternoon cross-referencing the Aramaic text with early Quranic commentaries, and what he discovered made his hands tremble. The shadows grew longer as he approached the modest apartment building where his former student, Dr. Amira Hassan, lived. She was one of the few people he trusted completely, a brilliant linguist who had specialized in pre-Islamic Arabian texts before becoming a respected Quranic scholar in her own right. If anyone could help him verify his translations and understand the full scope of what they were dealing with, it was Amira. Yahya climbed the 3 flights of stairs, pausing at each landing to catch his breath and listen for any unusual sounds. The paranoia felt foreign to him, a man who had spent decades in open scholarly debate and public discourse. But the threatening phone call from that morning had awakened something primal in him, a survival instinct honed by generations of his ancestors who had lived through various persecutions. He knocked softly on Amira's door, using their old signal from her graduate school days, 3 short taps, pause, 2 long ones. The door opened immediately, as if she had been waiting. "Professor Al-Rashid," she said, her dark eyes scanning the hallway behind him before ushering him inside. "You look terrible. What's happened?" Amira's apartment reflected her dual nature as both traditional scholar and modern academic. Shelves lined with classical Islamic texts stood alongside a state-of-the-art computer setup. Prayer rugs from different regions decorated the walls, while her desk was covered with printouts of digitized manuscripts from libraries around the world. "I need your expertise, Amira, and your discretion." Yahya set his satchel on her dining table and began carefully removing the wrapped fragments. "What I'm about to show you could be the most significant archaeological discovery in Islamic history. Or it could be an elaborate forgery designed to destroy everything we hold dear." Amira pulled on white cotton gloves and leaned over the ancient parchments as Yahya unwrapped them. Her breath caught as she recognized the distinctive script and aging patterns. "These look authentic," she whispered, her voice filled with academic excitement and growing concern. "The Aramaic dialect appears consistent with 7th century Hijazi region. Where did you find these?" "A contact in Jordan, part of a larger collection that was acquired from a private collector." Yahya decided against mentioning the mysterious circumstances surrounding their delivery. "I need you to read this passage and tell me if my translation is accurate." Amira bent closer to the text, her lips moving silently as she worked through the ancient script. Yahya watched her face transform from curiosity to confusion to alarm. "This can't be right," she said finally, looking up at him with wide eyes. "According to this text, there was a deliberate alteration made to certain verses of the Qur'an during the compilation under Caliph Uthman. It suggests that a group of companions disagreed with specific inclusions and that some original revelations were modified. That matches my reading." Yahya's voice was barely above a whisper. "But there's more. Look at the bottom of the second fragment." Amira followed his direction, her fingers hovering over the delicate parchment. It mentions a cache of original writings, hidden somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula. If this is authentic, if there really are original manuscripts that contradict the official Quranic text, it would fundamentally challenge the concept of perfect preservation that underpins Islamic faith, Yahya finished. The Quran's unchanging nature is a cornerstone of belief for over 1 billion Muslims. If that's called into question, they sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the implications settling between them. Outside, the call to prayer had ended, and the sounds of the evening, children playing, vendors calling out their wares, the distant hum of traffic, seemed to mock the gravity of their discovery. "What are you going to do?" Amira asked finally. "I don't know yet. These could be sophisticated fakes designed to sow doubt and division. There are groups that would benefit greatly from undermining Islamic unity. But if they're authentic..." His phone buzzed with a text message. The number was blocked, but the message was clear. "Stop digging or face the consequences. You have until tomorrow evening." Amira saw his face pale as he read. "What is it?" "It seems I'm not the only one who knows about these manuscripts." Yahya showed her the message. "Someone wants these findings buried, and they're willing to threaten me to ensure that happens." "Then we need to verify their authenticity quickly," Amira said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If someone is willing to make threats, these fragments might be more important than we realized. And if they're genuine, the Muslim community deserves to know the truth, regardless of how difficult it might be to accept." The ancient manuscript felt heavier in Yahya's hands than its physical weight should allow, as if the very words inscribed on the vellum carried the burden of centuries. He sat in his study, the morning call to prayer still echoing faintly from the nearby mosque, while shadows danced across the Arabic calligraphy before him. Each line he translated sent another chill down his spine. The document wasn't supposed to exist. According to every historical record, every scholarly consensus he'd built his career upon, this particular codex had been destroyed in the fires of Baghdad nearly 800 years ago. Yet here it was, its authenticity undeniable despite the impossibility of its survival. Dr. Sarah Chen had delivered it 3 days ago with trembling hands and a story that defied belief. She'd found it buried beneath layers of seemingly mundane administrative records in the Vatican's secret archives, misfiled and forgotten for centuries. What had started as routine research into medieval Islamic Christian correspondence had uncovered something far more dangerous. Yahya's phone buzzed insistently. He ignored it, his attention consumed by a particular passage that made his breath catch. The implications were staggering, threatening to unravel fundamental beliefs that had guided over 1 billion faithful for more than a millennium. The manuscript detailed a meeting that supposedly never happened, between key figures whose very interaction would rewrite the accepted narrative of early Islamic history. If authentic, and every fiber of his scholarly instinct confirmed it was, this document suggested that certain foundational texts had been deliberately altered, their original meanings obscured by political machinations of the medieval period. His office door burst open without warning. Yahya's head snapped up to find Imam Hassan al-Rashid standing in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely contained urgency. "You need to come with me," Hassan said, his voice tight. "Now." "Hassan, I told you I needed time to..." They killed Professor Morrison. The words hit Yahya like a physical blow. James Morrison, the Byzantine scholar from Oxford who'd been helping verify certain historical details, had been found dead in his hotel room that morning. The official report claimed heart failure, but Hassan's expression suggested otherwise. "How do you know it wasn't natural?" Yahya asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because Morrison called me 2 hours before they found him. He was terrified, said he'd discovered something in his research that people would kill for. He mentioned your name, Yahya. Whatever you've uncovered, they know you have it." Yahya carefully closed the manuscript and secured it in a climate-controlled case. His mind raced through the implications. If Morrison was dead, then Sarah might be next. And if they were willing to kill a respected academic in broad daylight, his own life expectancy had just shortened considerably. "Who are they?" Yahya asked, though he feared the answer would be more complex than Hassan could provide. "That's what we need to find out. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." As they prepared to leave, Yahya's computer chimed with an incoming email. The sender's address was a string of random characters, but the subject line made his blood freeze: the price of truth. Against Hassan's urgent protests, Yahya opened the message. It contained a single photograph: Sarah Chen's university ID badge, blood-stained and cracked. Below it, a brief message in Arabic: "Some knowledge is too dangerous to share. You have until sunset tomorrow to make the right choice." "They have her," Yahya whispered, sinking into his chair. Sarah had risked everything to bring him this discovery, and now she was paying the price for seeking the truth. Hassan read the message over his shoulder. "What could be so important that people are willing to commit murder? What exactly did you find in that manuscript?" Yahya stared at the ancient document case, weighing his words carefully. Even Hassan, despite their decades of friendship, might not understand the full gravity of what lay before them. "Evidence that could fundamentally challenge how Muslims understand their own history," he said finally. "Details about the compilation and preservation of sacred texts that contradict everything we've been taught. If this becomes public knowledge, it could trigger a crisis of faith across the entire Islamic world," Hassan finished, his face pale with understanding. "Exactly. But keeping it secret means letting innocent people die. Sarah didn't deserve this fate, and there will be others if we remain silent." The weight of the decision pressed down on both men. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in this small study, the future of their faith hung in the balance. Yahya picked up the manuscript case and met his friend's eyes. "I need to see the conspiracy for what it really is before I decide anything. But first, we have less than 36 hours to save Sarah's life." They left the office together, neither man realizing it would be the last time Yahya would see his life's work assembled in one place. The ancient manuscript trembled in Yahya's weathered hands as he spread it across his desk beneath the amber glow of his reading lamp. The parchment, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges, bore the distinctive calligraphy of 9th-century Baghdad, each Arabic letter flowing with the practiced elegance of medieval scribes. But it was the content, not the craftsmanship, that made his heart race. The document claimed to be a personal correspondence between two prominent scholars of the Abbasid period, discussing what they termed the necessary adjustments made to certain hadith collections. Yahya's eyes moved carefully across each line, his decades of scholarship allowing him to decipher even the most archaic terminology. What he read challenged everything he had devoted his life to defending. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. "Enter!" he called, not looking up from the manuscript. His assistant, Khalil, stepped into the office, carrying a steaming cup of mint tea. The young man's usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by visible concern since the morning's threatening phone call. "Professor, perhaps you should take a break. You've been hunched over that document for 3 hours." Yahya accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma. "Khalil, tell me, what would you do if you discovered that something fundamental about our faith, something millions of believers accept without question, might not be entirely accurate?" The younger man shifted uncomfortably. I suppose I would want to know the truth, regardless of how difficult it might be. Even if that truth could shake the foundations of belief for countless souls, even if it might cause more harm than good. Yahya's voice carried the weight of his internal struggle. Isn't truth always worth pursuing, Professor? Didn't the Prophet himself say that we should seek knowledge, even if it takes us to the ends of the earth? Yahya smiled sadly. You quote our traditions beautifully, but what if those very traditions are what's being called into question? Before Khalil could respond, Yahya's secure phone buzzed. He glanced at the encrypted message and felt his blood chill. Dr. Amira Rashid's latest communication contained a single line. The Vienna manuscript confirms your suspicions. We need to meet immediately. Amira was one of the few Islamic historians whose scholarship rivaled his own, and her expertise in manuscript authentication was unparalleled. If she had verified the document's authenticity, then the implications were staggering. The conspiracy wasn't merely contemporary, it had roots stretching back over a millennium. Yahya stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Khalil, I need you to make copies of everything in that filing cabinet. Use the secure scanner, encrypt the files, and upload them to our protected server. Sir, is everything all right? You seem... Just do as I ask, please. And Khalil? Yahya paused at the door. If anything happens to me, those documents need to reach Dr. Hassan al-Mahmoud at Oxford. Promise me. The young man's eyes widened. Professor, you're frightening me. What's going on? Yahya placed a paternal hand on Khalil's shoulder. I pray nothing will happen, but sometimes the pursuit of truth leads us into dangerous territory. 20 minutes later, Yahya sat in a small cafe 3 blocks from the university, nursing a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The establishment was nearly empty at this afternoon hour, which made it easier to spot the man in the dark suit who had followed him from his office. The surveillance was becoming less subtle, more intimidating. Amira arrived precisely on time, her hijab pristine despite the November wind outside. She slid into the booth across from him, her expression grave. The carbon dating is conclusive, she said without preamble. 9th century, possibly earlier, the ink analysis matches period samples, and the linguistic patterns are consistent with Abbasid-era scholarly correspondence. Yahya felt his last hope for a simple explanation evaporate. So it's genuine. I'm afraid so. Yahya, if this document is what it appears to be, if it's describing systematic alterations to hadith collections during the consolidation period, then we're looking at evidence of historical manipulation on an unprecedented scale. The implications would redefine how we understand the preservation of Islamic tradition. Yes, Amira leaned forward, lowering her voice. But there's more. I've found references to similar documents in 3 other manuscript collections. This isn't an isolated forgery or the work of contemporary conspirators. This appears to be a coordinated effort that began centuries ago. Yahya's mind reeled. The conspiracy he had uncovered wasn't just about contemporary power struggles within the Islamic world. It was about the very foundations of Islamic scholarship, about the processes through which sacred traditions had been preserved and transmitted across generations. What do we do now? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. We have to decide whether the truth is worth the chaos it might unleash, Amira replied. Because once we publish these findings, there's no taking them back. The faith of millions could be shaken to its core. Through the cafe window, Yahya noticed the man in the dark suit speaking into a small device. Time was running out. The elevator descended into darkness, its mechanical hum the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. Yahya's fingers trembled as he clutched the ancient manuscript, feeling the weight of centuries pressing against his chest. Each floor they passed brought him closer to a truth that could unravel everything he had devoted his life to understanding. The basement levels stretched before them like a vault of secrets, lined with climate-controlled chambers and reinforced steel doors. Dr. Qasim moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had walked these corridors countless times, her keycard granting access to areas that Yahya suspected few had ever seen. "The collection here predates most of what's displayed upstairs," she explained, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "These documents were deemed too sensitive, too controversial for public scholarship. Some have been buried for over 1,000 years. They stopped before a massive door marked only with Arabic numerals. As it swung open, Yahya felt his breath catch. The chamber beyond contained not books or scrolls, but digital workstations equipped with the most advanced manuscript analysis technology he had ever seen. Holographic displays showed three-dimensional reconstructions of damaged texts, while electron microscopes revealed details invisible to the naked eye. "This is where we've been working for the past 15 years, Dr. Qasim said, leading him to a central console. "Cross-referencing sources, analyzing carbon dating discrepancies, tracking the evolution of certain problematic passages through time." She activated the main display, and suddenly the air filled with floating text in multiple languages: Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, Persian. Yahya recognized fragments of verses, but their arrangement was unlike anything in the canonical texts he knew by heart. "What you're seeing," Dr. Qasim continued, "are the original sources, the texts that existed before the official compilation. Before certain voices were silenced, certain interpretations were buried, certain inconvenient truths were erased from history." Yahya's eyes scanned the holographic words, his scholarly mind automatically beginning to translate and interpret. What he read made his knees weak. These weren't just alternate versions or variant readings. They represented fundamental theological challenges that could shake the very foundations of Islamic doctrine. "This is impossible," he whispered, reaching toward a floating passage that seemed to contradict a core tenet of faith. "These can't be authentic. The dating, the provenance, all verified through multiple independent laboratories," Dr. Qasim interrupted. "Carbon-14, paleographic analysis, spectroscopic examination. Every test confirms what we've suspected. For decades, the official narrative we've inherited is incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst." The manuscript in Yahya's hand suddenly felt heavier, its leather binding slick with his nervous perspiration. He thought of his students, his congregation, the millions of believers around the world who trusted scholars like him to preserve and transmit their sacred heritage. How could he be the one to shatter their faith? "But why show me this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Why now?" Dr. Qasim's expression darkened. "Because others know about this collection, others who would use these discoveries not to enlighten but to destroy. There are factions within various governments and extremist groups who see these revelations as weapons, tools to discredit Islam entirely or to justify their own radical interpretations." She gestured toward another display showing a network of connections, names, dates, financial transactions. "We've been monitoring communications for months. There's a plan in motion to release selective fragments of these documents in a way designed to cause maximum chaos. They want to trigger a theological crisis that will tear the Ummah apart." Yahya stared at the conspiracy web before him, recognizing some names from academic circles, others from political spheres. The scope was staggering, a coordinated effort spanning multiple continents, funded by shadowy organizations with their own agendas. "The manuscript you're holding," Dr. Qasim said, "contains the key to understanding how all these fragments fit together. It's a guide, written by someone who witnessed the original compilation process, someone who knew which texts were authentic and which were later additions or modifications." The weight of responsibility settled on Yahya's shoulders like a physical burden. In his hands, he held not just ancient parchment and ink, but the potential future of his faith. The choice before him was becoming clear, and it terrified him. "If I help you," he said slowly, "if I authenticate this material and help you present it properly, it could prevent the chaos these conspirators are planning. But it might also challenge beliefs that billions hold sacred. And if you don't, Dr. Qasim replied, others will control the narrative. They'll weaponize these discoveries to serve their own purposes, twisting the truth into something destructive rather than illuminating. The holographic texts continued to float around them, ancient words suspended in modern light, bridging centuries of human faith and doubt. Yahya closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every prayer he had ever offered, every sermon he had ever given, every student he had ever taught. When he opened them again, his decision was made. The ancient parchment crackled between Yahya's trembling fingers as he held it up to the lamplight in his study. The Arabic calligraphy, written in an archaic script that predated most known manuscripts, seemed to dance before his eyes. Each word confirmed his worst fears about the conspiracy that had already claimed 3 lives and would likely claim his own before sunrise. His secure phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. The encrypted message from his contact in Damascus contained only coordinates and a time: midnight, 2 hours from now. Yahya memorized the location, a warehouse in the industrial quarter, then deleted the message. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he photographed the parchment with a specialized camera designed to capture ancient texts without damaging them. The doorbell's chime echoed through his empty house, followed immediately by 3 sharp knocks. Yahya's blood turned to ice. He had given his housekeeper the evening off, and no one else knew his private address. Moving silently, he extinguished the desk lamp and crept to the window overlooking his front garden. 2 men in dark suits stood on his doorstep, their posture suggesting military or intelligence training. Behind them, a black sedan idled with its engine running. Yahya recognized the taller man from surveillance photos in his research files, Agent Hassan Qureshi, an operative known for his ruthless efficiency in eliminating threats to certain powerful interests. A soft scraping sound from the rear of the house made Yahya's heart race. They had surrounded him. His scholarly life had never prepared him for this moment, but 40 years of studying Islamic history had taught him about the courage required when truth collided with power. Moving quickly but quietly, Yahya gathered the most critical documents from his research and stuffed them into a weatherproof satchel. The original parchment went into a specially designed protective case that he secured inside his jacket. If he died tonight, these documents had to survive. The future of Islamic scholarship, perhaps of Islam itself, depended on it. The sound of breaking glass came from his kitchen. They were inside. Yahya slipped through his study's French doors onto the small balcony overlooking his neighbor's garden. The elderly professor next door had been a colleague for 20 years, but involving him now would be signing the man's death warrant. Instead, Yahya lowered himself from the balcony and dropped silently into the shadows beside the garden shed. Footsteps echoed through his house as the intruders systematically searched each room. Light beams from their flashlights swept past the windows. Yahya pressed himself against the shed wall, calculating his options. The warehouse meeting was still 90 minutes away, but staying hidden until then seemed impossible. His phone vibrated with an incoming call. The display showed his daughter Amira's number. Yahya's finger hovered over the answer button before he forced himself to decline the call. Speaking to her now would only endanger her further. The conspirators had already demonstrated their willingness to target families. A beam of light swept across the garden, missing him by inches. Yahya heard voices from inside his house. They had discovered his study and found evidence of his research. Angry words in Arabic carried through the broken kitchen window, mentioning the parchment and expressing frustration at not finding it. Crouching low, Yahya began moving through his neighbor's garden toward the street. Each step felt like walking through a minefield. His academic mind raced through the implications of what he had discovered. The parchment contained evidence of a deliberation campaign spanning decades, designed to manipulate Islamic scholarship and gradually alter fundamental interpretations of the faith. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of several governments and religious institutions. Respected scholars had been bought or threatened into silence. Ancient texts had been hidden or destroyed. New interpretations had been subtly introduced and promoted through seemingly legitimate academic channels. But the most damning revelation was the ultimate goal: to create enough theological confusion and division that a new, supposedly purified version of Islam could be introduced by the conspirators' chosen leaders. It was cultural genocide disguised as religious reformation. Yahya reached the street and spotted a taxi turning the corner. He flagged it down and climbed inside, giving the driver an address 3 blocks from the warehouse. As they drove away, he watched his house recede in the rear window. The men were still inside, probably planting surveillance devices or worse. The taxi driver, an elderly Pakistani man, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You look troubled, brother. Everything all right?" Yahya met his eyes in the mirror and saw genuine concern. Here was an ordinary Muslim man, living his life in faith, unaware that forces beyond his comprehension were working to manipulate everything he believed. It was for people like this driver that Yahya had to succeed. "Just heading to an important meeting," Yahya replied. "One that could change everything." The warehouse district approached through the windshield, and Yahya steeled himself for what awaited in the darkness ahead. The call to Fajr prayer echoed across Cairo as Yahya stepped into the narrow alleyway behind the Al-Azhar library. Dawn painted the ancient city in shades of amber and gold, but the beauty of the moment was lost on him. Every shadow could conceal a watcher. Every footstep behind him might belong to someone who wanted him dead. He clutched the leather satchel containing the Damascus manuscript closer to his chest. Inside those weathered pages lay evidence that could vindicate him or destroy everything he had spent his life defending. The weight of it pressed against his ribs like a physical manifestation of his dilemma. The safe house Fatima had arranged was 3 blocks away, tucked between a spice merchant's shop and a small mosque. As he walked, Yahya's mind raced through the fragments of the conspiracy he had uncovered. The Guardians weren't just protecting ancient texts. They were actively manipulating modern scholarship, controlling which interpretations of Islamic law gained prominence and which scholars rose to positions of influence. A motorcycle engine roared to life somewhere behind him. Yahya didn't look back, but quickened his pace, turning into a side street that led toward the Khan el-Khalili Bazaar. The morning vendors were setting up their stalls, creating a maze of activity that might provide cover. The manuscript's contents haunted him. The 7th century document contained correspondence between early Islamic scholars, but more importantly, it included detailed accounts of debates that had shaped fundamental principles of Islamic jurisprudence. What made it dangerous wasn't heresy, it was authenticity. The document proved that many contemporary interpretations being promoted by certain influential scholars were deliberately distorted, serving political rather than spiritual purposes. Yahya ducked under a canvas awning as the motorcycle rounded the corner. Through gaps in the hanging carpets, he watched the rider scan the crowd. The man's face was hidden behind a helmet, but his methodical search pattern suggested professional training. The irony wasn't lost on Yahya that he was fleeing through the very heart of Islamic Cairo, past mosques that had stood for centuries, while carrying proof that modern guardians of the faith had betrayed its principles. The Guardians' corruption went deeper than mere academic fraud. They had systematically eliminated scholars who questioned their narrative, financing extremist interpretations that served geopolitical interests while silencing moderate voices. He slipped between 2 spice stalls, the aroma of cardamom and cinnamon masking his scent if they were using dogs to track him. The vendor, an elderly man with kind eyes, nodded respectfully when he recognized Yahya, despite his disguise. Even here, among the common merchants, his reputation preceded him. "Salam alaikum, Dr. Mahmoud," the man whispered. "Allah's protection be upon you." The blessing felt like both comfort and burden. How many faithful Muslims would curse his name if they knew what he carried? Yet how many would thank him if they understood the truth? The motorcycle had moved past, but Yahya knew it would circle back. He needed to reach the safe house within the next few minutes. From there, he could contact the journalists Fatima had mentioned, investigative reporters who specialized in exposing religious corruption but understood the delicate nature of faith communities. As he navigated through the awakening bazaar, Yahya thought of his daughter Layla in London. She had called yesterday, excited about her research into early Islamic manuscripts at the British Library. The irony cut deep. She was studying the very period that this conspiracy sought to obscure, unknowingly following in footsteps that might lead to the same dangerous knowledge. The safe house appeared ahead, its blue wooden door exactly as Fatima had described. But as Yahya approached, he noticed something wrong. The small chalk mark that was supposed to indicate safety had been erased from the doorframe. He stopped, pretending to examine a display of brass lamps while scanning for threats. The spice merchant's shop next door was closed, unusual for this time of morning. The small mosque's minaret provided an excellent vantage point for surveillance. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The truth you seek comes with a price. Library reading room. 1 hour. Come alone." Yahya deleted the message and continued walking, but his mind was reeling. Someone was playing a deeper game than he had realized. The Guardians weren't just trying to silence him, they wanted something from him first. The Damascus manuscript suddenly felt heavier in his hands. Perhaps it wasn't the only document they were concerned about. His decades of research had uncovered many uncomfortable truths, many connections between ancient scholarship and modern corruption. Maybe they needed to know exactly how much he had discovered before they eliminated him. Behind him, the motorcycle engine started again. This time, it was joined by another. They were closing the net, but they still needed him alive long enough to extract information. That gave him a small advantage, though he wasn't sure how long it would last. The morning sun climbed higher over Cairo, and with it, the stakes of his impossible choice grew ever more desperate. The encryption key materialized on Yahya's screen like a digital prayer answered. His hands trembled as he copied the long string of characters, each symbol potentially unlocking secrets that had remained buried for centuries. The monastery's ancient stones seemed to press closer around him as he initiated the decryption process, the laptop's fan whirring in the pre-dawn silence. Lines of text began cascading down his screen, Arabic script interwoven with Latin characters and numerical codes. Yahya's breath caught as he recognized the format. These weren't just correspondence records, but detailed financial transactions, meeting logs, and most damning of all, operational directives spanning decades. The guardians of the seal weren't merely preserving manuscripts, they were manufacturing them. His stomach lurched as he scrolled through fabricated hadith reports, complete with falsified chains of transmission dating back to the Prophet's companions. Entire theological debates had been seeded with carefully planted contradictions, designed to create schisms that could be exploited when the time was right. The precision was breathtaking and horrifying. A footstep echoed in the corridor outside. Yahya's finger hovered over the laptop's power button, but the sound faded. He forced himself to continue reading, knowing each passing moment brought him closer to discovery. The conspiracy's scope defied comprehension. Regional conflicts that had torn Muslim communities apart for generations. Many could be traced back to theological disputes sparked by documents the Guardians had strategically leaked to rival scholarly factions. They hadn't just been preserving Islamic history, they'd been rewriting it in real time, creating fault lines that would fracture the Ummah when activated. But why? The answer lay buried deeper in the files, in meeting transcripts that made Yahya's blood run cold. The Guardians weren't working alone. Financial records showed funding from sources across religious and secular boundaries, Christian evangelical organizations, secular humanist foundations, even certain government intelligence agencies, all united by a single objective, the systematic dismantling of Islam as a coherent global force. Dr. Hassan's voice echoed from another lifetime. Sometimes the greatest threat to truth comes from those who claim to protect it. Yahya's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We know you're there. You have 10 minutes to walk away." His hands moved faster across the keyboard, downloading files to multiple encrypted drives. The evidence was overwhelming, but he needed the activation protocols. the specific documents and revelations the Guardians planned to release, and when. There, a folder marked Final Revelation. Yahya's cursor hesitated over it, sensing that opening this file would cross a threshold from which there was no return. The monastery bells began their call to Fajr prayer, their bronze voices carrying across the valley like a warning. The file contained photographs of manuscript pages Yahya had never seen, written in a hand he recognized but hoped he was wrong about. The script was unmistakably from the early Mednan period, the ink and parchment bearing every sign of authenticity his trained eye could detect, but the content, the words seemed to burn themselves into his retinas. Statements attributed to the Prophet that directly contradicted fundamental Islamic principles, commands that would justify the very extremism that had poisoned Islam's reputation in the modern world. Instructions that would validate the harshest interpretations of Islamic law while simultaneously undermining the faith's core message of mercy and justice. If these manuscripts were released as authentic discoveries, they would devastate Islamic scholarship. Progressive Muslims would reject them as obvious forgeries, while extremist factions would embrace them as validation for their most violent interpretations. The resulting schism would tear the Ummah apart from within. But were they forgeries? The authentication data suggested otherwise, and that was the conspiracy's masterstroke. These weren't fabricated documents, they were genuine manuscripts that had been carefully preserved, while authentic texts promoting unity and compassion had been allowed to crumble into dust. The Guardians had been playing a centuries-long game of theological natural selection, ensuring that only the most divisive and problematic texts would survive to be discovered at the moment of maximum impact. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor now, no longer trying to mask their approach. Yahya ejected the USB drives and slipped them into the lining of his jacket. His laptop screen went dark as boots gathered outside the door. The door burst open with medieval finality. 3 figures in dark clothing filled the doorframe, their faces obscured by shadows and intent. Brother Marcus stood behind them, his expression a mixture of regret and resolve. Professor Al-Mansouri, the lead figure, spoke in accented English. "You've seen enough." Yahya stood slowly, his mind racing through possibilities for escape. The narrow window behind him looked out over the monastery's courtyard. 3 stories down, the USB drives felt like lead weights against his chest. "The truth has a way of surviving," he said, backing toward the window, "even when those who claim to serve it try to bury it." "Not this time," the man replied, stepping forward. "This truth dies with you." The ancient warehouse reeked of decay and motor oil, its broken windows casting fractured moonlight across the concrete floor. Yahya pressed his back against a rusted shipping container, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The manuscript, clutched against his chest, felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, as if the secrets within had their own gravitational pull. Footsteps echoed from the entrance, deliberate, measured, multiplying. They had found him faster than he'd anticipated. The GPS tracker Amara had discovered in his briefcase was just one of many surveillance methods they'd employed. How long had the council been watching him? Weeks? Months? Perhaps from the moment he'd first questioned the authenticity of the Medina fragments. "Dr. Al-Rashid." The voice belonged to someone Yahya recognized but couldn't immediately place. "There's nowhere left to run." Yahya closed his eyes, steadying his breathing. Through the broken skylights above, he could see the minaret of the nearby mosque, its green light blinking against the star-filled darkness. How many times had he stood beneath similar towers, calling the faithful to prayer, believing with absolute certainty in the words he recited. That certainty felt like a luxury from another lifetime. The manuscript's pages rustled as he adjusted his grip. Inside were photocopies of documents that would rewrite 14 centuries of Islamic history, proof that key passages in the canonical Qur'an had been deliberately altered in the decades following the Prophet's death. Political modifications designed to consolidate power rather than preserve divine revelation. The implications were staggering, potentially devastating to the faith of over 1 billion believers. "We know you've seen the documents," another voice. This one younger, more aggressive. You understand what's at stake. This isn't about suppressing truth. It's about protecting something greater than any individual scholar's pursuit of knowledge. Yahya peered around the container's edge. 5 figures moved through the shadows, their faces obscured but their intent unmistakable. These weren't common criminals or government agents. They moved with the quiet authority of men who believed themselves guardians of something sacred, protectors of a cosmic order that transcended ordinary moral considerations. His phone vibrated silently against his ribs. A text from Amara, package delivered. Contact made. Whatever happens, the story will be told. Relief flooded through him. The secondary copies were safe, already in the hands of journalists and academics across 3 continents. Even if they silenced him tonight, the truth would eventually surface. "Your daughter is quite brilliant," called the familiar voice, now close enough that Yahya could make out the speaker's silhouette. Professor Kandahar from the University of Istanbul, a man he'd shared meals with, debated scripture with, considered a friend. She inherited your intellectual curiosity. Unfortunately, she also inherited your stubborn refusal to accept necessary truths. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Yahya's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the realization that his choices had placed Amara in danger. She was thousands of miles away in London, but the Council's reach was global, their resources vast. How many other scholars had faced this same impossible decision? Truth or family, knowledge or love? "You've spent your entire career studying the historical development of Islamic texts," Kandahar continued, stepping into a shaft of moonlight. His expensive suit looked incongruous in the industrial decay surrounding them. "You know that revelation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It must be interpreted, contextualized, sometimes modified to serve the spiritual needs of the community. The documents you've found don't disprove faith. They demonstrate its resilience, its ability to adapt and survive." Yahya emerged from behind the container, the manuscript still pressed against his chest like armor. "You're asking me to accept that lies can serve truth, that deception can preserve faith. How is that different from the corruption we condemn in others? Because some deceptions protect what matters most." Kandahar's voice carried genuine conviction, the fervor of a believer who had reconciled apparent contradictions through sheer force of will. "Do you think Christianity collapsed when scholars proved the Gospels were written decades after Christ's death? Do you think Judaism crumbled when archaeologists found no evidence of the Exodus? Faith transcends historical accuracy. It serves deeper human needs than mere factual knowledge." The other figures had spread out, forming a loose circle around Yahya. Each wore the expression of men performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. They weren't evil, he realized. They were believers who had chosen community over truth, stability over revelation. In their minds, they were the heroes of this story. "The question isn't whether you'll give us the manuscript," Kandahar said sadly. "The question is whether you'll do so voluntarily, as a final act of service to the faith that shaped your life, or whether we'll be forced to take more drastic measures." Yahya looked up at the minaret's blinking light, remembering the young man who had once stood before it, certain that truth and faith were synonymous, believing that God's revelation could withstand any human scrutiny. That young man had been naive, perhaps, but he had been pure in his conviction. The manuscript's weight pressed against his ribs as he made his choice. The ancient library beneath Al-Azhar University felt like a tomb as Yahya descended the spiral stone steps, each footfall echoing in the darkness. His phone's flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating rows of manuscripts that had survived centuries of conquest, fire, and revolution. Somewhere in this labyrinth lay the proof he needed, if Hassan al-Mutairi hadn't already claimed it. His breathing came in short gasps, whether from exertion or fear he couldn't tell. The events at the archives had shaken him more than he cared to admit. 3 scholars were dead, and their blood was on his hands for trusting the wrong people. The conspiracy ran deeper than he'd imagined, reaching into the highest echelons of Islamic scholarship across multiple continents. The beam of light swept across a familiar section. medieval commentaries on Quranic interpretation. His fingers traced along the spines until he found what he sought, a collection of manuscripts from the 8th century, writings that predated the standardization of certain texts. If the forged hadith had originated here, as his research suggested, there would be traces. A sound from above made him freeze, footsteps on stone, measured and deliberate. Someone else had entered the library. Yahya extinguished his light and pressed himself against the shelves, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sweep of another flashlight across the ceiling above him. He recognized the voice before he saw the figure, Dr. Amara Hassan, his former colleague from Cairo University. "I know you're here, Yahya," she called softly. "We need to talk." He remained hidden, unsure whether she was friend or enemy. Their last conversation had ended in bitter disagreement about the direction of Islamic scholarship in the modern world. She'd accused him of being too rigid, too unwilling to embrace necessary evolution. He'd called her a revisionist. "The foundation didn't kill those scholars," Amara continued, her voice echoing in the chamber. "That was Al-Mutairi's doing. He's eliminating anyone who might expose his real agenda." Against his better judgment, Yahya stepped into the open. Amara stood 20 feet away, her hijab slightly disheveled, exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes. She wasn't armed, but that provided little comfort. "How do I know you're not working with him?" Yahya demanded. "Because if I were, you'd already be dead." She lowered her flashlight so it wouldn't blind him. "Hassan al-Mutairi isn't trying to preserve traditional Islam, Yahya. He's trying to destroy it from within." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "The forgeries aren't new. They're corrections." Amara moved closer, her voice urgent. "Someone has been introducing false hadith into the canonical collections for decades, subtly altering the foundation of Islamic jurisprudence. Al-Mutairi's group has been identifying and removing these corruptions, but they're using the crisis to consolidate power." Yahya's mind reeled. If what she said was true, then everything he thought he understood about the conspiracy was backwards. "Show me proof." Amara reached into her bag and withdrew a tablet computer. The screen displayed a complex chart showing textual variations across different manuscript traditions. "I've been tracking the anomalies for 2 years. Look at the pattern. Every single variation appears first in texts that passed through specific restoration projects." The evidence was damning. Yahya recognized several of the manuscripts, prestigious works that formed the backbone of modern Islamic legal interpretation. If they'd been compromised, the implications were staggering. "Who's behind the forgeries?" he asked. "That's what Al-Mutairi is trying to discover. But his methods—" Amara shook her head. "He believes the corruption goes so deep that the only solution is to start fresh, with a new clerical hierarchy under his control. He's using the crisis to justify a complete restructuring of Islamic authority." A new sound interrupted them, the heavy footsteps of multiple people descending into the library. Amara grabbed Yahya's arm. "We have to go. There's another way out through the old archives." They moved quickly through the stacks, their flashlights dancing across centuries of accumulated knowledge. Behind them, voices called out in Arabic and English, coordinating a search. Yahya clutched the manuscripts he'd gathered, suddenly uncertain of their value. If Amara was right, he'd been chasing shadows while the real threat consolidated power. "There," Amara whispered, pointing to a narrow passage between 2 massive bookcases. "It leads to the old manuscript restoration room." They squeezed through the gap, just as lights appeared at the far end of the chamber. Yahya could hear Al-Mutairi's voice among the others, calm and authoritative as he directed the search. The man who'd positioned himself as Islam's savior might be its greatest threat. The restoration room was cramped and dusty, filled with equipment for preserving ancient texts. Amara led him to a window barely wide enough for a person. "This opens onto the courtyard. From there, we can reach the street." As Yahya prepared to climb through, he turned back to her. "If you're lying to me, then we're all dead anyway." she replied grimly, "but I'm not lying. The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice to save your faith?" The encrypted files from Hakim's laptop painted a picture so devastating that Yahya's hands trembled as he scrolled through document after document. In the privacy of his study, with dawn prayers still hours away, he absorbed the full scope of the conspiracy that had been decades in the making. The Shadow Council wasn't merely a group of radical clerics seeking power. They were systematic destroyers, methodically corrupting Islamic scholarship from within. False hadiths had been inserted into respected collections. Manuscripts in major libraries across the Muslim world had been subtly altered. Even modern translations of the Qur'an had been tainted with minute changes that would accumulate over generations into profound distortions. Yahya's breath caught as he recognized names on the council's membership list. Imam al-Rashid from Cairo's Al-Azhar University, whose commentary on Islamic jurisprudence was studied worldwide. Dr. Mansouri from Tehran, whose research on early Islamic history shaped seminary curricula across 3 continents. These weren't fringe extremists. They were pillars of Islamic academia, men whose words carried the weight of religious authority for hundreds of millions of believers. The scope was breathtaking in its audacity. They had infiltrated translation committees, academic review boards, and publishing houses. They controlled which scholars received prestigious appointments and which manuscripts received funding for preservation. Over 30 years, they had positioned themselves to slowly reshape Islam itself, bending it toward their vision of a faith that justified their hunger for temporal power. A soft knock interrupted his horror. Sarah entered with tea, her face drawn with worry. "You've been in here for 6 hours," she said, setting the cup beside his laptop. "What have you found?" He turned the screen toward her, pointing to a spreadsheet that tracked their corruptions by region and time frame. "They're not trying to destroy Islam, Sarah. They're trying to replace it, inch by inch, word by word, until what remains bears only a superficial resemblance to what the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually taught." Sarah leaned closer, scanning the meticulous records. "These manuscripts they've targeted, some are over 1,000 years old. The oldest and most respected sources," Yahya confirmed. "If you can corrupt the foundation texts, everything built upon them becomes suspect. Future scholars, acting in perfect good faith, will perpetuate these falsehoods because they trust the sources." His phone buzzed with a text from Amara. "Council meeting moved to tonight. Emergency session. They know something." Yahya showed Sarah the message. "I have to go to this meeting. It may be our only chance to expose them all at once. It's a trap." Sarah's voice was flat with certainty. "They killed Hakim for less than what you now possess." "Perhaps. But if I don't act tonight, they'll scatter, change their methods. It could take years to track them all down again, and by then, how much more damage will they have done?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "There's something else, something you're not telling me." Yahya hesitated, then opened another file on the laptop. "They have plans beyond just corrupting texts. They're preparing to release fabricated revelations, documents they claim are newly discovered sayings of the Prophet. They have forged papyrus, aged ink, even testimonials from respected archaeologists who have been either bribed or blackmailed into authentication." The color drained from Sarah's face as she read. This would cause a schism that could last centuries, or destroy scholarly credibility entirely. Who would trust any historical Islamic text if such sophisticated forgeries were possible? Yahya closed the laptop. "They've created a weapon that could shatter the faith of millions, reduce Islam to chaos and doubt. Then we take this to the authorities, the police, the press, the Islamic councils in every major—" "With what credibility?" Yahya interrupted gently. "I'm already being portrayed as unstable, possibly heretical. These men have spent decades building their reputations, their word against mine, especially after Hakim's death. They'll claim I fabricated everything out of grief and paranoia." Sarah began pacing, her analytical mind racing through alternatives. "Then we find other proof, independent verification. There must be witnesses, other victims. There are. Yahya pulled up another file. But most are dead. The few survivors are too terrified to come forward. He showed her a list of scholars who had died under suspicious circumstances over the past decade: car accidents, sudden heart attacks, drownings. All had been researching historical inconsistencies in texts now known to be corrupted by the Shadow Council. "There's something else," Yahya said quietly. "According to these files, my own work has been targeted. Papers I published 5 years ago on early Quranic manuscripts. They've been preparing to discredit them by revealing planted evidence that my research was based on forgeries they themselves created." Sarah stopped pacing. "They've been setting you up for years." "They're not just rewriting Islamic history," Yahya said, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "They're destroying anyone with the knowledge and credibility to expose them. Tonight's meeting isn't just about damage control, it's about eliminating the last remaining obstacle to their success." He stood, his decision crystallizing despite the fear, "which is exactly why I have to be there." The ancient library beneath Al-Azhar University felt like a tomb as Yahya descended the narrow stone steps, his breathing shallow in the dusty air. Dr. Khalil's trembling hands guided the flashlight beam across crumbling manuscripts and leather-bound volumes that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had grown distant, but Yahya knew their respite was temporary. "Here," Khalil whispered, pointing to a section where the shelves seemed deliberately sparse. "The restricted collection. What we seek has been hidden here for over 400 years. Yahya's fingers traced the spines of texts he'd only heard whispered about in academic circles. Commentaries deemed too dangerous for public consumption, historical accounts that challenged accepted narratives. His heart hammered against his ribs as Khalil pulled aside a false backing, revealing a metal box wrapped in oiled cloth. "The manuscript of Ibn Rashid al-Tabari," Khalil breathed. "Written in 1623, suppressed by order of the Ottoman Sultan himself." With reverent care, Yahya unwrapped the ancient pages. The Arabic script was elegant despite its age, each word carefully preserved. As he read, the ground beneath his faith seemed to shift. Ibn Rashid had been present at the council of scholars that had made crucial decisions about hadith authentication. His account painted a picture of political maneuvering, personal vendettas, and deliberate alterations that had shaped Islamic jurisprudence for centuries. "This changes everything," Yahya murmured. "If believers knew that some of the hadith they follow were selected not for their authenticity but for their political convenience, you begin to understand why Malik and his brotherhood exist," Khalil said grimly. "They've known this truth for generations, but instead of using it to purify the faith, they've weaponized it for control." Footsteps echoed from above. Khalil's eyes widened with terror. "They've found us!" Yahya clutched the manuscript to his chest. The weight of knowledge felt heavier than lead. Everything he'd dedicated his life to, every sermon, every fatwa, every moment of guidance he'd provided to struggling believers, had been built on foundations that were more fragile than he'd ever imagined. "There's another way out," Khalil whispered urgently, leading Yahya deeper into the labyrinthine basement. "But you must decide quickly. Will you use this knowledge to destroy faith or to restore it?" The question pierced Yahya like a blade. As they navigated between towering shelves, he thought of Amira, of the millions who found comfort in their beliefs, of the pilgrims he'd watched weep with joy at the Kaaba. How could he shatter that peace? Yet how could he allow Malik's conspiracy to succeed? They emerged through a concealed exit into an alley behind the university. Dawn was breaking over Cairo, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Yahya blinked in the sudden light, the manuscript still pressed against his chest. "Dr. Badawi." The voice came from the shadows. Malik stepped into view, flanked by 2 men Yahya didn't recognize. The archaeological director looked tired but determined. "You've led us quite a chase. You can't suppress the truth forever," Yahya said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Malik smiled sadly. "Truth? Which truth, Doctor? The one that tells believers their most sacred practices might be based on political compromises? The one that suggests their ancestors were fallible humans rather than perfect transmitters of divine will? That truth? The truth that sets people free. Freedom? Malik laughed bitterly. I've seen what happens when faith crumbles. I've watched communities tear themselves apart when certainty dissolves into doubt. The Brotherhood exists to prevent that chaos, by manufacturing false evidence, by manipulating scholars, by murder, by preserving what matters most, the spirit of faith, even if some of its historical foundations are imperfect. Khalil stepped protectively in front of Yahya. The young generation deserves honesty. They're strong enough to handle complexity. Are they? Malik's eyes glittered dangerously. Tell me, Dr. Badawi, what will you do with that manuscript? Publish it and watch mosques empty? Watch young Muslims abandon their prayers because some medieval scholar documented political intrigue? Watch the Ummah fragment into 1,000 arguing pieces? The weight of the decision pressed down on Yahya's shoulders. In his hands lay the power to reshape Islam itself or to destroy it. The manuscript contained truth, but truth that could devastate millions of lives built on faith. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called the authorities. Choose quickly, Malik said, his hand moving to his jacket. Give me the manuscript, and this ends quietly. Keep it and face the consequences of unleashing chaos upon the world. Yahya looked at the ancient pages, then at Khalil's hopeful face, then at Malik's desperate determination. The sirens were getting louder. Time was running out, and with it, his chance to decide the fate of everything he'd ever believed in. The ancient stone steps beneath Yahya's feet seemed to pulse with the weight of centuries as he descended into the hidden chamber beneath Al-Azhar's oldest wing. The manuscript clutched against his chest felt like it was burning through his robes, its revelations threatening to consume everything he had ever believed about his faith's origins. Behind him, Khalil's labored breathing echoed in the narrow passageway. The old librarian had insisted on accompanying him despite his frail condition, claiming that some secrets were too dangerous for one man to bear alone. Their flashlight beams danced across hieroglyphs and early Arabic inscriptions that predated the university's official founding by centuries. The Brotherhood has been searching for this place for decades, Khalil whispered, his voice barely audible above their footsteps. They know it exists, but the exact location has been passed down through only 3 families of scholars. My family was one of them. Yahya paused at an iron door embedded in the limestone wall. Ancient symbols surrounded a keyhole that looked untouched by time. What exactly are we going to find down here, Khalil? What could be so damaging that the Brotherhood would kill to suppress it? The old man's weathered hands trembled as he withdrew an ornate key from beneath his robes. Evidence that the 7th Codex isn't the only early manuscript they've been hiding. There are others, Yahya, documents that reveal how certain interpretations were deliberately altered in the 3rd century to consolidate political power. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal a chamber that took Yahya's breath away. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each filled with manuscripts, scrolls, and codices in various states of preservation. The air was dry and still, preserved by some ancient ventilation system that continued to function after all these centuries. My God, Yahya breathed, stepping into the repository. How many are there? Over 300 documented pieces, Khalil replied, moving to a central table where several manuscripts lay open. Some date back to the very earliest communities. They tell a different story about the development of Islamic jurisprudence and theology than what became orthodox teaching. Yahya approached the table, his scholar's eye immediately drawn to the elegant script of what appeared to be a letter. As he read, his blood ran cold. The document was correspondence between early Islamic rulers and Byzantine officials discussing the deliberate suppression of certain textual variants that emphasized mystical rather than legalistic interpretations of faith. This suggests that entire schools of early Islamic thought were systematically eliminated, he said, his voice hollow. Not through theological debate, but through political machination. Khalil nodded gravely. The Brotherhood's predecessors weren't just preserving Islamic purity, they were creating it by destroying anything that didn't serve their vision of centralized religious authority. The seventh codex was just the beginning. A sudden sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, were moving through the library above. Yahya quickly photographed several key pages with his phone, while Khalil gathered 3 of the most significant manuscripts. "We need to leave," Khalil urged. "If they find this place, they'll destroy everything," Yahya finished. The weight of decision pressed down on him like the tons of stone above their heads. These documents could revolutionize Islamic scholarship, returning the faith to its diverse, mystical roots. But revealing them would also validate every criticism of Islamic authenticity that enemies of the faith had ever made. The footsteps above grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking in urgent Arabic. Yahya recognized one of them as Mahmud's lieutenant from the Brotherhood. They were running out of time. "There's another exit," Khalil said, leading him toward the back of the chamber. "It connects to the old drainage system that leads to the Nile." As they moved through the repository, Yahya's mind raced through the implications. The Brotherhood wasn't just protecting Islam from modern threats. They were protecting a carefully constructed version of Islam that had been shaped by political considerations over a millennium ago. The faith that millions practice today was authentic in its devotion, but potentially false in its foundations. They reached a narrow tunnel entrance just as they heard the iron door above rattle. Someone was trying to force their way into the chamber. Khalil pressed 2 more manuscripts into Yahya's hands before ushering him into the tunnel. "Whatever you decide to do with this knowledge," the old man said, his eyes bright with urgency, "remember that truth serves God, even when it challenges our understanding of how we serve God." The sound of the iron door crashing open echoed through the chamber behind them as they crawled through the ancient tunnel. Yahya clutched the manuscripts against his chest, feeling the terrible burden of choice settling around him like a shroud. In his hands lay the power to either heal Islam by returning it to its mystical origins, or wound it so deeply that it might never recover from the revelation of its constructed nature. Behind them, angry voices filled the hidden repository as the Brotherhood discovered their most precious secret had been breached. The ancient stone steps descended into absolute darkness, each footfall echoing like a heartbeat in the narrow passage. Yahya's flashlight beam cut through the suffocating black, illuminating weathered walls carved with verses that predated most known manuscripts. Behind him, Layla's breathing came in short, controlled bursts as they moved deeper into the hidden chamber beneath the dome of the rock. "The temperature's dropping," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their movement. Yahya nodded, feeling the cold seep through his robes. They had perhaps 2 hours before Al-Mansouri's men would breach the outer defenses. The coded message he'd sent to Reuters and Al Jazeera would mean nothing if they couldn't retrieve the proof from this sacred vault. The passage opened into a circular chamber, its domed ceiling lost in shadow. Yahya's light swept across the walls, revealing shelves carved directly into the rock, each containing scrolls and codices wrapped in silk that had somehow survived 14 centuries of conquest and upheaval. But it wasn't the manuscripts that made him catch his breath, it was the floor. Beneath their feet, inlaid in precious metals that caught and reflected the flashlight's glow, was a massive map of the ancient world. Trade routes, pilgrimage paths and centers of learning spread across the floor like golden rivers, all converging on a central point marked with a crescent moon and star. "Yahya," Layla breathed, kneeling beside one of the shelves. "Look at this." She held a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful Arabic script. The handwriting was unmistakably modern, 20th century at the oldest. As Yahya took the journal, his hands trembled slightly. The first page bore a name that sent ice through his veins: Hassan al-Masri. Not the current al-Masri, his grandfather. "It's a record," Yahya murmured, scanning the pages rapidly. a detailed account of Operation Preservation, initiated in 1948. They've been systematically removing and replacing historical documents across the Islamic world for decades. Layla moved to another shelf, her fingers tracing along spines of manuscripts. But why preserve the originals here? Why not destroy them entirely? The answer came to Yahya with horrible clarity as he read further into the journal. Insurance, control. Knowledge is power, and they needed to ensure they could always prove the truth if circumstances required it. He looked up at her, his face grim in the flashlight's glow. They never intended to destroy Islam's history. They wanted to own it completely. A distant rumble echoed down the passage, explosions from above. Al-Mansouri's forces had arrived sooner than expected. Yahya moved quickly to a specific section of the shelves, his fingers finding purchase on what appeared to be solid stone. A hidden panel slid away, revealing a small alcove containing a single manuscript bound in midnight blue leather. The Codex Damascenus, the complete record of early Islamic scholarship that proved beyond doubt the authentic chain of transmission for the Qur'an's text, is what they feared most, he said, cradling the Codex carefully. Absolute proof that their manufactured controversies are lies. The textual tradition is unbroken, perfect in its preservation. Layla had found a cloth satchel and was rapidly filling it with the most crucial documents. The journal, correspondence between conspirators across 3 generations, financial records showing the operation's massive scope. The sound of footsteps echoed from the passage above, growing closer. "There's another way out," Yahya said, pointing to a narrow opening partially concealed behind one of the manuscript shelves. "It leads to the underground cisterns. We can reach the surface through the old city's drainage system." As they prepared to leave, Layla grabbed his arm. "Wait, the tracking device in your phone. They'll follow us wherever we go." Yahya nodded and pulled out his cell phone, but instead of destroying it, he began typing rapidly. "I'm uploading everything to the cloud servers of every major news organization simultaneously. If we don't make it out, the evidence still reaches the world." The upload bar crept forward with agonizing slowness as the sound of voices grew louder in the main passage. Yahya could make out Al-Mansouri's distinctive tone, cold and controlled even in the echoing chamber. 90%, Layla whispered, watching the screen. Heavy footsteps on the ancient stone steps. 95%. The beam of powerful flashlights began to penetrate the outer chamber. "Upload complete," Yahya breathed, then smashed the phone against the stone floor. They slipped through the narrow opening just as the first figures appeared in the main chamber. Al-Mansouri's voice echoed behind them, sharp with fury, as he realized the vault had been compromised. The escape tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to move in single file through passages that had been carved centuries ago for purposes they could only guess at. Water dripped steadily from above, and the air grew thick with moisture as they approached the old cistern system. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew fainter, but never disappeared entirely. Al-Mansouri would not give up easily, not when his family's century-long conspiracy hung in the balance. The ancient stone walls of the underground chamber seemed to pulse with the weight of centuries as Yahya's trembling fingers traced the final lines of the Damascus Codex. The air was thick with dust and the metallic taste of fear. Above him, he could hear the distant sound of boots echoing through the monastery corridors. They had found him. Brother Marcus stood sentinel by the narrow entrance, his weathered face etched with worry. "They're searching the upper levels systematically," he whispered. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before they discover the hidden passage." Yahya's eyes burned as he absorbed the last devastating revelation contained within the ancient manuscript. The conspiracy wasn't merely about suppressing historical documents. It was about fundamentally altering the spiritual foundation upon which millions of believers built their lives. The Codex contained correspondence between early Islamic scholars and Christian theologians, documents that revealed collaborative efforts to establish common theological ground in the 7th century. But more than that, it showed deliberate modifications to certain hadith traditions, changes that had shaped Islamic jurisprudence for over a millennium. His phone vibrated against his chest. A message from Layla, airport secured, plane ready. "Where are you?" Yahya stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. In his jacket pocket lay the encrypted drive containing digital copies of everything: the Damascus Codex, the Vatican letters, the financial records linking the conspiracy to contemporary political movements across the Middle East. With this evidence, he could expose the truth that would vindicate the reformist scholars, prove that Islam's foundational flexibility had been deliberately obscured by those who benefited from rigid interpretation. But the cost would be catastrophic. The footsteps above grew closer, accompanied by sharp voices in Arabic and Italian. Brother Marcus pressed his back against the wall, listening intently. "They're questioning the monks about hidden chambers. Someone will break soon." Yahya closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his father's legacy pressing down upon him. Imam Hassan al-Rashid had spent his life defending traditional interpretations, building bridges between conservative and progressive Muslim communities through careful, incremental change. The revelation that some of those traditional interpretations were themselves the product of ancient political maneuvering would shatter that careful balance. "Dr. al-Rashid," Marcus urged quietly, "we must decide. There's another passage that leads to the valley, but we need to move now." The scholar's mind raced through the implications. If he released the Codex, reformist movements would claim vindication, but conservative clerics would face a crisis of authority. In the resulting chaos, extremist groups could exploit the confusion, claiming that if ancient scholars could manipulate texts, then only the most literal interpretations could be trusted. The very flexibility that the Codex proved Islam originally possessed could be used to justify even greater rigidity. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. "Breaking: Turkish government announces crackdown on moderate Islamic organizations, citing security concerns." The conspiracy was already in motion, using his research as justification for their actions. By framing him as a dangerous radical, they had provided cover for systematic suppression of the very voices that could guide Islam through the turbulence ahead. The sound of splintering wood echoed from above. They had found the hidden panel. Yahya pulled out the encrypted drive and stared at it in the dim light of Brother Marcus's lamp. Everything was there: proof that would vindicate his academic work, evidence that would expose the financial networks funding extremist interpretations, documentation that could reshape Islamic scholarship forever. "Doctor, please," Marcus whispered urgently. In that moment, Yahya understood his father's true wisdom. The Imam had known that truth without wisdom was merely destruction. The question wasn't whether the revelations in the Codex were accurate. They were. The question was whether humanity was ready for them. Boots thundered on stone stairs, multiple voices getting closer. Yahya made his choice. He quickly typed a message to Layla: "Upload Protocol 7. Tell them I died before talking. The drive was destroyed." Protocol 7 was their contingency plan. Carefully selected portions of the evidence would be leaked slowly over years, attributed to various sources, allowing the Islamic community to gradually absorb the implications without experiencing catastrophic shock. It would mean his academic vindication would never come, that history would remember him as either a footnote or a failed radical. But it would also mean that the conspiracy would lose their crisis to exploit, that moderate voices would have time to prepare for the revelations, and that the faith of millions would be preserved while still allowing for growth and reform. Heavy footsteps approached the chamber entrance. Yahya deleted the message thread and powered down the phone. Brother Marcus gripped his shoulder, eyes wide with understanding. "The other passage?" Marcus whispered one final time. Yahya shook his head and carefully placed the ancient codex back in its protective case. Some truths were too important to die, but too dangerous to be born suddenly into an unprepared world. The first armed figure appeared in the chamber entrance, weapon raised. The encryption key lay hidden in the 14th century manuscripts marginalia, where medieval scribes had unknowingly preserved what would become the salvation or damnation of modern Islam. Yahya's fingers trembled as he traced the faded Arabic numerals, each digit corresponding to verses that, when decoded, revealed coordinates leading to the Brotherhood's primary server farm in Dubai. "You found it," Amira whispered, her voice barely audible in the ancient library's silence. Outside, dawn was breaking over Cairo, painting the walls in hues of amber and gold. They had 12 hours before the Brotherhood's planned revelation would echo across every mosque, every Islamic center, every faithful heart worldwide. Yahya nodded, though victory felt hollow in his chest. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed against his ribs like a stone. The fabricated documents weren't just sophisticated forgeries. They were masterpieces of deception, woven with enough authentic historical threads to fool even the most learned scholars. Worse still, they exploited genuine gaps in the historical record, filling voids that faithful Muslims had always accepted with trust rather than proof. "The pilgrimage records," he murmured, pointing to a section of text. "They've created an entirely false narrative around the Prophet's companions. If these documents surface during today's global broadcast, they'll suggest that the fundamental stories we tell about Islam's origins are built on lies." His phone buzzed. Another encrypted message from Hassan. "Security breach detected at the server facility. They know we're coming. Abort mission?" Yahya closed his eyes. Through the library's windows, he could hear the first call to prayer beginning across the city. In a few hours, millions would gather for Friday prayers, trusting in the same stories that the Brotherhood sought to destroy. Their faith, built over 14 centuries, could crumble in a single afternoon. "There's another way," Amira said suddenly. She'd been studying the decoded coordinates on her laptop screen. "The transmission doesn't originate from Dubai. That's just a relay station. The real source is here, in Cairo, underneath the Al-Azhar complex." The revelation struck Yahya like lightning. Al-Azhar, the 1,000-year-old center of Islamic learning, where he'd spent decades studying, teaching, believing. The Brotherhood hadn't just infiltrated Islam's intellectual heart, they'd hollowed it out from within. "Dr. Mansour," he breathed. The university's chancellor, his mentor, the man who'd guided his career and shaped his understanding of Islamic scholarship. The same man who'd recommended him for this investigation. Amira's laptop screen flickered, displaying security footage from the Al-Azhar underground levels. There, in rooms that officially didn't exist, banks of servers hummed beneath vaulted stone ceilings. Ancient architecture housing modern deception. "It's a trap," Yahya realized. "Mansour knew I'd trace it back here. He wants me to come." "Then we don't go," Amira said firmly. "We alert the authorities, expose what we know through other channels." But Yahya was already standing, his decision crystallizing like morning frost. The authorities are compromised. Hassan discovered that 3 days ago. And even if we could reach trustworthy officials, who would believe us without proof? The Brotherhood has spent years establishing credibility for their false narrative. He walked to the library's eastern window, where Cairo spread below them, like an illuminated manuscript itself, ancient and modern layers intertwined, sacred and secular spaces coexisting in delicate balance. In 12 hours, that balance would shatter. "There's something else," he said quietly. "In the original documents I studied last month, before I knew they were forgeries, they referenced a fail-safe protocol. If the primary revelation is disrupted, the Brotherhood has a secondary plan. They'll release everything simultaneously through social media, conspiracy theory networks, and anti-Islamic websites. Even if we stop today's broadcast, the poison will still spread." Amira joined him at the window. "So what do you propose?" Yahya pulled out his phone and began composing a message, not to Hassan, not to any government agency, but to a secure network he'd never thought he'd need to use, a digital dead man's switch he'd prepared years ago, containing his complete scholarly work, his authentication methods, and detailed refutations of common anti-Islamic propaganda. "I'm going to Al-Azhar," he said, "but not to stop the transmission, to hijack it. That's suicide, Yahya." "Maybe. But if I can access their broadcast system, I can turn their weapon against them. Instead of releasing forged documents, we'll transmit the complete truth, the real historical evidence, the authentication process, everything. Let the world see both the lies and the methods used to create them." He finished typing and showed her the message, a detailed confession, explanation, and call to action that would be automatically sent to journalists, scholars, and Islamic leaders worldwide if he didn't check in every 6 hours. "Mansour expects me to come quietly, to negotiate or capitulate. He doesn't expect me to burn down the entire conspiracy on live television." The morning call to prayer reached its crescendo across Cairo's minarets. In the distance, the Al-Azhar Mosque's ancient tower stood silhouetted against the rising sun, waiting. The call to Fajr echoed across Damascus as Yahya made his final preparations. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to unleash upon the world. The USB drive containing the codex translations felt impossibly heavy in his pocket, each gigabyte a potential earthquake that could reshape Islamic scholarship forever. The Grand Mosque's ancient stones seemed to whisper warnings as he approached. Inside, hundreds of worshippers had gathered for what the Islamic Council had announced as an urgent address regarding recent scholarly discoveries. They had no idea they were about to witness either the salvation or destruction of their faith's historical foundations. Yahya spotted familiar faces in the crowd, colleagues who had trusted him, students who had revered him, faithful who had sought his guidance. Among them lurked the shadows he'd come to recognize, council operatives, government agents, and those whose allegiances remained deliberately unclear. Dr. Rashid sat in the front row, his face a mask of calculated concern. Beside him, Imam Hassan clutched prayer beads with white knuckles. "Brothers and sisters," Yahya began, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate hall, "for 40 years, I have dedicated my life to understanding our sacred texts, to preserving the wisdom of our ancestors, to protecting the faith that binds us together." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. These people knew him, respected him. That trust would make what came next even more devastating. But what happens when preservation becomes suppression? When protection becomes deception? When the guardians of truth become its greatest enemies? The murmurs shifted, uncertainty creeping into voices that had moments before expressed confidence. Dr. Rashid's eyes narrowed. Yahya withdrew a tablet, its screen displaying the first page of the codex. In 847 CE, a scholar named Ibn Masara documented discrepancies he discovered in early Quranic manuscripts. His findings, contained in what he called the Damascus Codex, revealed that our holy text underwent more extensive human editing in its earliest years than official histories acknowledge. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Someone in the back began reciting protective verses. Others leaned forward, hungry for details that might destroy everything they believed. The Islamic Council has known of this document for decades. They've suppressed it, hidden it, killed to protect it. Last week, they murdered Professor Amira Nazir for attempting to publish these findings. Yesterday, they tried to murder me. Chaos erupted. Voices rose in denial, in anger, in desperate questions. Some worshippers fled toward the exits, while others pressed closer, demanding proof. Security guards moved through the crowd, but their targets remained unclear. Dr. Rashid stood abruptly. Brother Yahya speaks from a place of deep trauma. The stress of recent events has clearly affected his judgment. These are the ravings of a man who has lost his way. "Explain this," Yahya said, activating a projection system that filled the mosque's walls with images of ancient parchment covered in careful Arabic script. "Explain why Ibn Masara documented 17 different versions of what became standardized verses. Explain why the Council maintains a secret archive containing these variants. Explain why they've spent centuries ensuring no one could study them. The projected text was undeniably authentic. The age of the parchment, the style of the calligraphy, the linguistic patterns all confirmed its antiquity. Scholars in the audience began reading aloud, their voices trailing off as they grasped the implications. The truth, Yahya continued, is that our faith is stronger than those who would protect it believe. Islam has always been a living tradition, shaped by human hands guided by divine inspiration. Acknowledging that our texts evolved doesn't diminish their sacred nature. It illuminates the beautiful, complex process through which God's message reached us. Imam Hassan rose from his seat, tears streaming down his weathered face. You don't understand what you're doing, my son. Faith requires mystery. Take away the absolute certainty, and what remains? What remains, Yahya replied gently, is trust. Trust in God's ability to work through imperfect human vessels. Trust in our community's strength to embrace difficult truths. Trust that our faith can withstand honesty about its own history. The crowd had split into factions, some demanding the projections be stopped, others insisting on seeing everything. Arguments broke out between families, between neighbors who had prayed side by side for years. The fractures Yahya had feared were already appearing, but something else was emerging too. Voices calling for calm, for dialogue, for careful study rather than blind reaction. A young woman near the front spoke clearly above the din. If this is true, shouldn't we want to know? Shouldn't understanding our history make us better Muslims, not worse ones? Others picked up her question, turning it into a chorus that gradually overwhelmed the voices of denial. Yahya watched as his community began the painful, necessary process of confronting its past. As sirens approached the mosque, Yahya uploaded the complete codex to servers across the globe. The secret was out, spreading through networks too vast for any conspiracy to contain. His final choice was made. The future of Islam would be decided not by those who hoarded truth, but by those brave enough to embrace it.